Great. So, welcome to UX Greece Meetup. I'm Ioannis Feneris, Dimitris Stathis, Panagiotis Zacharias, and Dimitris Niavis. The co-organizers are right next to me. This is a joint event of Athens and Thessaloniki UX communities. As a quick intro and welcome, Panagiotis, a few words about Athens community.
Yeah, just wanted to say hello to everybody and welcome to this great session today. I'm Panagiotis Zacharias. I'm the organizer of Athens UX Community. As I said, we are doing this in collaboration, the two UX communities in Greece, Athens and Thessaloniki. And just wanted to say a special thank you to our fellow Dimitris Niavis, because Dimitris was the guy who had the idea, and I know that he put a lot of effort to make this happen today. And he made the contact actually to Lou. Actually, is it Lou or Luis?
I usually go by Lou, but I will not be upset if.
Okay. Just wanted to say that you know that you are a legend in the UX world, and we are thrilled to have you here. And I'm sure that this is going to be a great session. No further delay from me. Just wanted to say hello on behalf of Athens UX community, and not to forget to say thanks to my fellow guys, Zansi Labs, who are sponsoring our community along with the UX Prodigy. So thank you very much, and I'm sure that we are going to have a great session.
Thanks, Panagiotis. Dimitris, how about some words about Thessaloniki UX community? Dimitris Stathis.
So, hello, guys. It's really nice that I see so many of you familiar and familiar faces, and even more the non-familiar faces. So I'm Dimitris Stathis. We've been organizing Thessaloniki UX Meetup with Yannis for the past 3 years. With, let's say, something like 1,200 members, and it's really great to have a co-collaboration with other meetups in order to achieve something like this. And I want to thank everyone who's here today and everyone who has participated in organizing this, and of course to Lou for being here to talk to us. So let's continue.
Thanks, Dimitris. We also want to thank our sponsors that support this event and also the events of its community. So thanks to Zansi Labs from Scratch Design Studio and the UX Prodigy. And we have some gifts to give at the end. So Zansi Labs and from Scratch Design Studio are going to give some great books, and we're going to talk about them today. And the UX Prodigy will give some special offers on their upcoming courses, workshops. So stay here to tell you what you can do to get them. Or you can start participating in winning a book right now. Just drop a post in LinkedIn, ask or saying anything using the hashtags UX and UX Greece. And I think that it's time to welcome, to officially welcome Louis Rosenfeld to our meetup. Just let me remind everyone that this is a Q&A session. We want to ask whatever you want. We want you to ask whatever you want. So drop your questions here in the chat. We will get them and ask them to Luis, or you can raise your hand to ask directly, but just keep in mind that you will be recorded in this case. We have already gathered your questions that you made at the LinkedIn, and so we will start with them. So, okay, Dimitris, I will leave it to you to make a proper introduction here on who is Luis, and drop the first question and start this session.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and especially Lou. Lou, for the ones of you that don't know him or his work, is a information architecture veteran, really battle tested, and a legendary publisher. He's the founder of Rosenfeld Media, which, if you don't know, I suggest that you definitely go right now. I'm gonna post a link in the chat, or not right now, but make sure that you check Rosenfeld Media. They got amazing books on UX, great conferences, and the best communities around UX topics that I personally have found for the last 2 years. Yes, I don't know if I have anything else to introduce. We will hear it from Lou. So, Lou, tell us a few things of what you're doing right now. What are you up to these days?
Sure. Well, first of all, before I do that, I want to thank you all for two things. One is the people who organize UX Greece, UX Saloniki, and UX Athens, and anyone who organizes is a hero. So I'm doing the jazz hands thank you for all of you to take a bow. I don't want to forget at the end. So let's thank everyone, thank the organizers who are doing not just this meeting, but I'm sure many meetings that really do bring people together, help us learn together, help us become a true community. So thank you for that. Dimitris, Yanis, and Panagiotis, and I'm sure I've mispronounced your names, so my apologies. And speaking of mispronouncing words, obviously I don't speak Greek, and I think it's very generous of you to have this meeting in English. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate that, and as you know, it's not easy. I've tried to speak UX in Spanish on occasion, and I know how hard that is. So again, more jazz hands, thank yous for accommodating me, at least in my native language. What am I doing these days? So this is always a funny question because many of you are probably here because you associate me with information architecture. And, you know, on my gravestone, when I die, there will be a polar bear from the cover of the polar bear book that O'Reilly published that I co-authored. In fact, I'm very excited because this is one of the few audiences that I can wear my special shirt in front of, and you'll recognize what I'm wearing here. Can you see this? It's my polar bear shirt. I was so happy when I found it. But you may not realize that the first edition of the Polar Bear book, we were writing that in 1996, 1997, and it's come out in 4 editions, and it's changed quite a bit over that time. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about why we had to do so many editions. But what I found my way into UX around 20 years ago and found it such an interesting area because it seemed like a very vibrant, broad umbrella for not just what information architects were doing, but a lot of other interesting practices that came together where there was a very interesting synthesis. And that became my home. And I felt very much like investing effort into bringing UX people together. I did a lot of volunteer work in the UX community. And I also felt like we needed more UX books. In fact, the Polar Bear book was the first UX book that O'Reilly published. And so I decided rather than creating UX books for an existing publisher, I'm kind of an entrepreneur. And so I started Rosenfeld Media about 16 years ago. And we are a dedicated publisher of UX books. We've published, I think, about 50 books and learned a lot about user experience and information architecture by working on books, which are information systems and which we take for granted, but are very open to innovation. And especially in the digital space, digital books are very interesting. And so I've learned a lot about IA and UX from books, from making books rather than reading them. And because I work with a lot of talented people, many of whom are authors, it's not surprising that I ended up getting drawn into producing conferences. And we now produce 4 different conferences a year. And those are also incredible opportunities to work in UX. and in IA, because conferences and their programs are very much, or should be, research-driven products that work certain ways for certain audiences and create certain experiences. And when you are working on conferences, you're working with lots of people. And so we found that our business expanded into hosting communities that are associated with our conferences. And so we do that. Dimitris Niavis was mentioning that a little earlier, and we host 4 discrete communities that meet monthly and have paid curators and monthly activities and newsletters. And they're a lot of fun. And by the way, guess what? Communities can teach you a lot about both information architecture and user experience design. So a lot of my experience in the last 10, 15 years is intense UX, intense IA, but not on apps, not on websites, more on books, conference programs, and communities. But I know a lot of you have questions about websites and apps, and I'll do my best to fake a good answer here or there. So that's what I've been up to, and hopefully that's interesting. Should we get to questions, Dimitris?
Sure. First, I would like to say that I love that you talked to us about information architecture and UX, not just as about applications and website, but again as a bigger whole, that we can apply this knowledge to do almost everything in our lives. And I'm really, really happy about this. And the way that you frame information architecture in the book back then as information environments, I really love this because it transcends the website. It can broaden our minds. All right, so to start with a question from John, it's about publishing. So let's use this as a transition. John asks us, you helped publish so many books and have such an insight about the industry. What is the best UX book that hasn't yet to be published on UX?
Oh, hasn't yet to be published? Oh my.
Yes.
Okay, that's a really hard one, but a really great question. So I want to dig into that a little bit, because I can tell you that there are certain books that I really think we need. And so the best book that hasn't been published yet, I would surmise, is a book that truly pulls together under one umbrella all kinds of research techniques, methods, and types of analysis, where you have the qualitative and the quantitative researchers collaborating, where you have the attitudinal and the behavioral researchers collaborating, where you have the people who are working with data versus the people that are working with semantic information collaborating. I am wearing a shirt with polar bears, but the Rosenfeld Media logo is an elephant. And that's because there is a great fable that you may be aware of, the elephant and the blind men. And I'll show you a picture, if I can share my screen really quickly. And let's see, I had it handy a moment ago. Here we go. All right, let me share screen. So this is actually sketched by Dave Gray, one of our authors. You may know Dave. And the fable is, I think, thousands of years old. The fable is that there's a group of blind men walking around together for some reason without anyone who wasn't blind with them to help. And they're walking in the jungle, and they come across an elephant. And the elephant, they don't know it's an elephant. And one of them touches the trunk and says, "Oh, it's a snake." And another touches a leg and says, "No, it's not a snake, it's a tree." And so on and so forth. And until they talk together and synthesize what they've found and look at their evidence together collectively, they cannot arrive at the true insight of the fact that they found an elephant. And this is what I want to see a book on. This is what I want to see someone really, really figure out how to write, which is how to pull together all those different sources of data that are currently in different silos, in different organizations, and bring it together in a way that we can actually get a picture of the truth of what our users are trying to do or are experiencing that's much greater than the parts. And I wrote an article years ago on this, and I've actually convened a small community to look at this informally. And I just don't understand why there's not more people pushing toward it. I do think the mixed methods people are to some degree, but I think it's not ambitious enough. I think you need to really figure out a way to bring in the data science people into this discussion. Anyway, if someone could write that book, it would be a Rosetta Stone for so many research-related disciplines to work together and to have a conversation that they cannot have right now because they don't speak the same language, they don't have a shared framework, they don't have common points of reference. So that's a long answer to a very innocent question, maybe not so innocent.
That's a great answer. And we love long answers. This is why we're doing this today. Thanks very much. So let's get to another domain of questions and ask about current hot issues in industry. And I'm going to be talking about agile environments. Xanthippe has asked this question. I would like to ask if there are any pitfalls that you have observed when working in agile environments and agile development regarding information architecture and UX. If so, what has worked well for you in order to avoid those pitfalls? And would there be anything that you would do differently today if you had the option?
So, Agile is a religious term. Just like people have centuries-long bloody wars over whether to cross themselves with 2 fingers or 3. What is Agile? It's very easy for me to talk about Agile in the sense that I've never worked in a technically Agile environment. And you also have to understand that I have not worked for an organization other than my own in 25 years. So I've only seen and talked with people about Agile. So please take my answer with a huge, huge grain of salt. That said, one of the big problems I think we see about information architecture and how it's perceived is that it is something that is slow, which obviously in some sense may fly against Agile, which is obviously working on a different cadence, and that it's invisible. Information architecture is invisible. And so it's the type of thing that isn't really easy to work with in the context of a sprint. That doesn't mean Agile has no value. It just means that I don't know that there are obvious Agile paths to developing information architectures or improving information architectures. And so if you're only working in an Agile mode, you may be leaving out things like information architecture, which is problematic in the long run. And it's easy to leave out because it's invisible. I'm going to share another screen. I love this diagram. It's pretty much in every talk I ever give. It's a diagram by Stuart Brand, who's, among other things, one of the founders of the Long Now Foundation. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. It's called the pace layering model. And what Brand says, and I just think this is just such a brilliant but simple, straightforward insight, is that things move at different paces. They have different cadences. So in the world, in the universe, the laws of nature don't really change. Probably not at all, unless you move yourself from a Newtonian space to working with a different definition of time and space. But most of us don't get to that. But as you move further out, each layer you see more dynamism. So something like fashion is constantly in flux. It works at a very different, very dynamic, very quick-paced cadence. And what I like about this model is that it's non-binary. So it acknowledges the fact that, if you're working on, let's say, an app or a feature, you're working in this outer layer that might be very dynamic. You need to move quickly for many different reasons. If you're working in information architecture, you're kind of down here. You're working in an area that shouldn't really have to change very much, or its ability to change should be built in almost itself. More like it should really be more like a platform for change that itself doesn't necessarily change. That we can dig into that a little more if you like, but that the information architecture is something that you have to use different methods than Agile most likely to work at, but that they're not mutually exclusive, or they shouldn't be. It's okay. In fact, it's expected, or should be expected, that all paces, all cadences are good cadences for the right application. Does that help?
Like a lot.
Okay.
Great.
Great.
So many questions that
I faked my answer pretty well. Good.
Dimitris, so many questions that we can follow up this answer. So
yeah, let's start with the shorter one.
Yeah.
Shorter question. I don't know about the answer. So another Dimitris is asking, where do you see information architecture going, given the pervasiveness of voice interfaces, machine learning in our lives? And what is your greatest hope for UX in the next years?
Oh, let's take the first one about IA in an era of chatbots and voice interfaces and so forth. I'm actually very optimistic that IA is going to be in greater and greater demand. We may not call it IA because IA as a brand has its problems, but the work itself is going to only grow in demand because of voice interfaces and conversational interfaces. Because information architecture is largely about having a system to surface semantic value. So when we look at let's say, content on a website, what we're trying to do is create enough structure, not too much, but enough structure in the content so that pockets of semantic value emerge. In other words, if you look at something as simple as a document, the document can contain many objects, like it could contain information about a person, it could contain a title, it could contain a problem statement. And an information architect should be able to look at content like that, whether it's one document or thousands, and look to have that structure become more defined so that means of access, whether it's a search engine or a navigation structure or whatever, can access that content. So the structure has to rise to the surface so that it's indexable or accessible in some other way. And I feel with conversational interfaces, we are doing exactly the same thing. We are trying to broker the question that a user has with content through access structures, which is language, which is a robot's language. And you have to have a strong understanding of what content you're trying to, what semantic value you're trying to have rise to the surface to make accessible to that conversational robot to broker a conversation with the user. So it's all about structure, enabling semantics, enabling ideas and semantic value to rise to the surface. You can't have a good conversational interface if your robot doesn't know where to look for answers or how to recognize the better answers from the answers that aren't so useful.
Great. So, Luis, this is my question, and I have to to ask you this question, although I know that there's no answer here. So, has the definition of what is UX changed from the 90s? Do we think of something else today than back then when referring to the UX and the information architecture?
Well, okay, so one of the things that normally happens in any emergent area, not always, but often, is that we pan back over time. So I think a lot of people used to think of UX at the interface level, which was fine. And that's where we were at the time. And now we call those people UX UI, right? And which is fine too. But meanwhile, we've moved backward successively to areas that are more systems oriented and more beneath the surface. So you could argue that service design is a logical next step from interaction design. You could argue that systems thinking is a logical next step from service design. And so I think what we're starting to see are areas that are both broader, that are being synthesized with UX. So, I mean, we can start looking at behavioral psychology. We can start looking at economics. We could start looking at a lot of other broad areas and see interesting intersections when we are already ourselves looking at what we do at a broad level, at a systems level. You know, if you're looking at a very micro level, you can do the same thing. I think it's a little harder to look at the interface of an app and draw a direct connection to behavioral psychology or economics. You can do it. I just think it's easier for our brains to manage that when we're starting and looking at what we already do at a broad level. I think one of the interesting things about UX also, one of the beautiful things about it is that it's supple, it's flexible, and it's always synthesizing. It's always changing. And so it does respond to its surroundings by growing and morphing. And so I'm starting to see areas like data science intersecting with what we do more and more. I'm starting to see areas like, you know, the whole world of customer experience, which is really, when you scratch the surface, there's a lot of interesting different aspects to it. Product management is another area that we are intersecting with more and more. And I expect you'll continue to see that. There's just like this constant synthesis that goes on in our minds and in our community. And I find that very exciting. Never gets boring.
Yeah, great. Dimitris, let's talk about product management, because we have a question about that.
Yes, all right. So Mike is asking that modern digital app development is fast, and evolution even evolves, even within a few months, can be tremendous. There are always things that we know we don't know, and things we don't know that we don't know. How can one make information architecture decisions that will be able to scale with such an application and won't end up as dead in 6 months?
So, you know, that's interesting. It goes back to some degree, surfacing content with semantic value and then providing access to it, which is really what information architecture is about. If you are working in an environment that is moving very quickly, what you need to do is hedge your bets. You need to have different options that not only allow you to not have all your eggs in one basket. In other words, if you're providing multiple ways for people to access content through your app, no one of them has to be perfect, but also as you learn and maybe as your users change over those 6 months, you're going to have multiple avenues to see what they are, what they are responding to. So to me, the mark of a strong information architecture is not over relying on one form of access, one variety of navigation, or just on search. And again, if you support at least a few, that will give you the flexibility to adapt over that 6-month period.
Okay, great. I think that Vasilis, you asked a question in the chat. If you want, you can ask directly, Louis. If not, I can ask this question. So you can raise your hand or just open your microphone. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to do it.
Do it for me,
Dennis. Thank you, Vasilis. Okay, so Vasilis is asking, it's hard to believe that nowadays we are striving to convince digital product managers and owners about the value of UX research and design. So a comment on that, please.
Well, it's early. I know it's these days we shouldn't have to be doing this any longer, right? On the other hand, it's not been very long in the big picture that we've been doing this. I totally hear you. I hear the frustration. We're actually about to launch a new book in February by Christian Crumlish, which is called Product Management for UX People. And it's partly because so many UX people have that sense of frustration. On the other hand, some of them want to become product managers. So that's another use case for the book. But product managers who don't come from UX are very different in outlook. I mean, they are often essentially business people. And their motivations, their metrics, their goals are very different in many cases. So it's frustrating. But I don't think it's surprising. I just think it's the sort of thing that is just going to take a long time to get through. Now, what might be interesting is to think about ways that UX people can get through to product managers. And some of you might have some really great suggestions for how to do that. Maybe we want to do that in the chat channel. But what I find still frustrating, but still hard to avoid, is that UX people have to go more than halfway toward product managers in order to work with product managers. And so in many respects, that means learning the language of metrics. And actually, what I see a lot of UX people doing is when they make that move, it's not so painful. It's not so painful for them as they may have thought, because what they often find is they're improving the metrics. It becomes yet another place to collaborate. And so I encourage you to look deeply at metrics, question them in a way that is open-minded and open-hearted, so that when you are questioning them with your product manager here, you do it in a way that doesn't put them on the defensive. But actually look at the metrics as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to have a conversation with a product manager. And actually, maybe as you try to learn them, you will come up with ideas to improve them that the product manager will not only appreciate, but will begin to appreciate you and respect what UX does.
A follow-up question.
Thanks, Louis.
Panagiotis, yeah, please.
Well, just actually a comment. I think that most of the UX professionals, tend to employ quite easily metrics in a tactical level. What about what we say about the strategic level? And what about the association of what we are doing in user studies with business outcomes? I think there is a huge, let's say, gap over there. And there is a gap of knowledge, at least on our behalf, when it comes, to business kind of metrics. So a comment on that, please, Lou.
I'm not sure I have much to offer there, but let me try. I'll try to fake a good answer. If not, I'll fake a bad answer. The issue with that I think you're talking about with business metrics at a strategic level is that they leave out metrics that actually address the experience. Is that correct? That there's just a gap between metrics that are only about business performance versus what a customer experience is, right? Is that a fair statement?
Well, actually, yes. They tend to ask us about, the value of our work in terms of business outcomes. I mean, most of the times, we found ourselves quite comfortable to talk about, things like usability testing and how
right.
We could prove that UI redesign was better than another one and things like that, how the users did all the tasks that they were supposed to do in less time, things like that. But when it comes to, things like return of investment, you know what I'm saying.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing. You could argue that the business metrics and our metrics ultimately line up very nicely and in many cases are the exact same. In other words, a business succeeds typically, in theory, if its customers are happy, if they're having good experiences with that business and its products and services. The issue is, in my mind, the timing. So if a product development cycle, development and acceptance is 3 years, and the business is working on a quarterly basis to make its the fund the investors happy. They need to see quarterly returns, but the product cadence is much longer than that. That's where you have the problem. That's where you have the conflict of, let's say, a product manager looking to cut corners in the short term in order to show short-term benefits that line up with business metrics, even though there's going to be a long-term debt, a long-term cost in terms of the customer experience. And that is really terrible, right? I mean, that's a terrible situation for a designer to find themselves in, where they know that it's not the metrics, it's the timing that's the problem. And the expectations of showing progress too soon, too quickly. And I don't really have a good answer for that. And I wish I did. And if I did, I'd write a really, really popular book. Again, this is something to be interesting to see if anyone else has a comment on. Maybe Panagiotis, you have something that you would say there.
Well, actually, there are no definitive answers, as you said. But the thing is that we need to cover a lot of gap between us and the business side. And this is challenging. This is a great thing to do, a great goal to achieve, but quite hard at the same time.
Absolutely.
And we need some help. I mean, we are not supposed to be alone in this. We need some help, because I got the feeling that most of the time, they ask us to cover this gap.
So it's interesting. So if the question is less about alignment of metrics and more about alignment of expectations and the timing of those expectations, then it might be interesting to talk to our Agile friends, because the cadence they work at is much friendlier to the cadence that businesses measure their performance on. And can you take a play from their book and isolate aspects of your product design process that are at the outer layer of the PACE layer model, at the interface level perhaps, that show progress in a measurable way on the cadence that the business wants, namely, let's say it's a quarterly cadence, while still working separately, maybe secretly, on the inner layers of the PACE layer model, things like information architecture, things like service design. do they care? Do they ask you about that? Do they push you on that? Or are they just happy enough that you showed them something on the cadence that they wanted performance to be measured on? That's a big question, but that's maybe a partial answer to the question.
Can I add something here and also ask you a question? Panagiotis said about the business versus the UX, functions and domains, and how we have this alignment and this bridging. Is this a job for the product people to do this? So to align the business, the tech, the viability, the visibility, the desirability with the UX. And the follow-up question is, how do you see this thing on the job industry regarding product design, which is product strategy and product management and UX and UI and research? How are we still, is it too early, to be sure on what its job description is about, or have we did something wrong the past years?
Okay, two really good questions. So the first one about, isn't this all what we're just talking about with metrics and so forth, the product manager's job? I don't think it's the product manager's job. I think it's the good product manager's job. And therein lies a big problem. Product management is still very early. I look at partly through the eyes of a publisher, and I publish product management books because we're all overlapping, we're all doing synthesis. That's great. But there's not like a dedicated body of knowledge that's been accrued over product management, like let's say even UX. Compared to UX, there's a lot more UX information out there than product management information. And that's because product management is new, not very mature, and it doesn't have sort of this ethos of synthesis. I just used a couple Greek words, didn't I? You're welcome.
That's true.
So that no ethos of synthesis to really, pull together these different threads and put them into a new practice. So I think we're looking for those product managers, and some of us will become those product managers who are successful in that way, but there are just not many people yet who've got, and they don't just go to college or grad school to learn this. They have to get experience in the workplace to really understand this, and it's just going to take time. Now, the second question, if I understood you, is about, oh my gosh, now we're all talking about product experience and product design and product whatever. And there's that dreaded feeling that many of us have when we encounter a new framing or a new label for things that we've already maybe been doing for years and years and years. I personally think we worry about that far too much. I think it's okay. It's okay. It's a yes and. When a whole bunch of people enter the industry under the label product design, the worst thing we can do is sneer at them. What we need to do is say, oh, that's great. We've been doing something similar. Maybe it's the same, maybe not, but for some reason you got here when you got here. What's the context for you getting here? Are you people who come from a very different background than UX people do? Is that why you've come in under this different label? Or are you finding that UX is a bad framing as a brand, or it's just not working as a body of knowledge? I think it's actually an opportunity to learn. I'm also going to share another article I wrote with a really stupid name. It's called Moment Prisons. And it gets into, among other things, this fixation on labeling and how damaging it is if we over-index on labeling and if we expect labels to be durable. So if you think UX is what we're always going to call it, and that's always what it should be called forever and ever, you've got a rude awakening coming. It's not going to be a pretty thing for you. I think we have to be very cautious about getting too loyal to terminology because it's really going to damage us and be divisive for us in the long run. So if you're interested in more on that, the link I just pasted has information on that.
I think we can have a whole discussion about how we name things and the impact it has on our daily lives. But let's have a question from Dimitra. So in consumer UX, it says, but not UX, in the practice, because we don't know how it's going to be called. What are the first steps you would consider important when redesigning the information architecture of a live website with millions of customers?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great question. And what I always think is so important is in information architecture in general, and I think I have an article on this, is the idea of the ZIF distribution. So I'll type it in chat so you can see how ZIF is spelled. I have an article. I'll see if I can pull it up while talking. The ZIF distribution is a distribution that looks like it's a curve that goes very high on the left, and then it drops off into the long tail. So it's very steep, and then it suddenly jumps down into the long tail. And I actually, well, all right. So what do I mean by this? I wish I had my visuals handy here. It means that in an information architecture, in any information system, you're going to find that a handful of queries or information needs that your users have are account for the large majority of all activity on the site. In other words, people only need a few things from your site when it comes to information. They don't need a lot. They need a few things, and they need those same things over and over and over again. Those are the things at the steep part of the distribution. And then as you go down, down, you get into very esoteric needs that they have, the long tail. And that short head, those very common needs, we often don't do a very good job of supporting in our sites or our information systems. Our information architectures can be constantly upgraded, constantly tuned, constantly improved in a scalable way if we identify those common information needs that people have and support them. And you can do it again and again every month. You can look at your most common searches, test them out, see how they perform. You could look at your analytics to learn other things as well, to learn something about their information needs. And you have to focus on those things because they change over time. But you have to focus on those things more than anything you can or anything you can do. And it doesn't even cost you a lot of money. It's not very resource intensive to do what I'm describing. But that's my suggestion, is not to redesign an information architecture, but to tune it by focusing on those common information needs that account for the very large portion of all traffic on your site.
Okay.
I'll see if I can find the article while we're going.
Is it on Smashing Magazine?
Yeah, it is. Do you have the URL? Can you paste it in?
Yeah, just
Already in
posted.
the chat,
Yeah.
I'm gonna just, I'll pull up, oh, you did it already. Thanks, Demetrius. So I'll just pull up an illustration. Oh, they redesigned their site. Interesting. So just so I can show you what the ZIF curve looks like instead of using my fingers and waving them in the air. And a great illustrator, Eva Lam, who's based in Berlin, created a version of these illustrations. So, oops, let's try that again. Right. She's so good. Anyway.
Yeah.
It just keeps disappearing. I don't understand it. Can someone go yell at Vitaly Friedman? I don't know why these, all right, well, here's another way to look at it. Here's a university website, and you're looking at the queries that people searched for a given month. And in that month, the number one query was campus map. Only 7,000 times. That was only 1.4% of all the search activity. Doesn't sound like very much. By the time you get to the 14th most common query, in this case, housing, that's being searched 2,400 times. So we're dropping down the distribution curve, but now we're up to 10% of all the search traffic. 14 queries to get to 10% of all the traffic. Top 42 queries, unique queries, get you to 20%. 100 gets you to 30%. This is a rule. This is true for your site too. So I'm just talking about search queries. You can have other types of ways of expressing information needs. Regardless, if you focus on these top ones, whether it's the top 10 or 15 or 100, you will dramatically improve the information architecture performance of your site. That's like, to me, the most important thing you should know about information architecture is this ZIF distribution, which won't show. Let me try it one more time.
Is this a kind of a Pareto law? 20.
Yes, it's the same as Pareto. Exactly.
Everywhere.
There we go. Pareto is one of them is an economist and the other is a linguist. I think Pareto is the economist and ZIF is Bradford is another law. It's another way to express this, the Bradford laws in economics. That means that most people, the richest few people have the most money. And that's Bradford's law, but it's the same distribution.
All right, so that answer leads to another question from Sotiris now. So it's again a practical one. Which research methodologies have you observed to be the most effective when it comes to iteratively informing a labeling system? It's getting geeky. So is there a way to achieve the above and at the same time mitigate the impact that any potential changes might cause on user familiarity?
Well, okay, I didn't quite hear the rest of the question, but there's some obvious choices for methods to help understand labeling, but the one that isn't so obvious is using search analytics, because in search analytics, people explain in their own words what they want from you. And so it's not just their own words. You'll start to see synonyms, but you'll see some synonyms are much more prevalent than other synonyms. And I'm going to do a plug for a book I wrote that talks about how to do this, search analytics for your site. And then what was the rest of the question, Dimitris?
The rest of the question, is there a way to achieve the above and at the same time mitigate the impact that these changes will have on the user familiarity?
I don't know the answer to that. I could try to think it through, but we'd probably run out of time.
All right, okay. So there is, we will have to get in touch with Lou about the answer. We have an incoming question. Alex is asking, how can we make the most out of our time and efforts in an organization with low UX maturity? And he has a comment that says, I have read the UX team of one and it helped a lot.
I'm glad it's helped a lot. Which, by the way, the UX team of one came out 7 years ago. It's actually selling more now than when it came out. Interesting aside to me, at least. You're in a low maturity UX organization. You're trying to get people to understand the value of what you do and the value of UX. And there's a number of things you can do. And one of the things that I like to do, that I've seen colleagues do, is buy candy. So you go around to people in your organization And you want to meet them, you want to talk with them, and it's kind of silly, but I know people have done this. They knock on doors. Oh, there's people in marketing, or there's people in HR, or whatever that should overlap with what I'm working on, and they need to know about me. So they knock on the door with candy, and what a great way to break the ice. And it's a nice sort of common conversation item, and it's basically relationship building. And I saw someone that I know do this at a huge US e-commerce company, where she actually did that. She would go around and talk to people, and try to get them to smile a little bit and be nice to her simply because she brought them candy. But eventually, enough of them took her seriously enough and had enough interesting conversations with her that they started to talk together about what they shared in common. That led to a brown bag lunch series of presentations that they began making to each other about what they knew about their customers. And eventually they started working together in a formal way. So they went from community of interest to community of practice to a formal dotted line connection in the way their silos or their teams work together. And eventually they became a single organization focused on research, customer research. A company, by the way, is REI, if you've heard of them in the US, huge e-commerce company. So this is a serious and meaty company that was able to do this. Again, the way she did it, and the way I see most people do it, is by creating relationships that build over years. Question for you, who asked the question of me, is do you want to wait years? And do you want to be the instrument that catalyzes the maturation of your organization when it comes to UX? That's a great thing to do. It just takes a lot of patience and a lot of time, and not everyone has that. So I wouldn't hold it against you if you didn't, but if you want to see that happen, you're going to do it yourself. You're going to have to start doing it yourself and be prepared for a long, long grind.
Okay, that triggers me to ask another question, a question with no answer, but I have to ask you this. So the obvious answer to everything is in design and product is research and discover. Proceed with the correct hypothesis and validation, triangulate your discovery, make sure you have enough data for decisions, or be aware of the risk, move with the smallest viable steps. But in fact, research can never end. So even if you have statistically correct quantitative data for the X issue, the actual parameters that affect these are chaotic. And there are so many thousand decisions that you have to make for a single, even the simpler product, that you can never research enough for everything in the depth that you want to. So everything is about risk management in design and product. My question, and my rhetorical question is, what is this value for effort ratio of research? Is there any golden rule of risk versus validation? What do we stop in our research depth?
Oh gosh, I don't know what the calculation would be, but I would be very uncomfortable measuring it, because I feel that if you're a researcher, and even if you're not a researcher, but you're someone involved in some form of design, which implies you're moving into a new unknown to some degree space, how could you do it without being curious? How could you not be doing at least some form of informal research that's just a function of your own curiosity about the space? But there are some tactical issues to what you're talking about. So let me see if I can bring up something else that I'd like to share with you. Give me just a moment. And I think it's right here. I have a bunch of tabs for you. And naturally, they're not all handy when I need them to be. But I do want to show you a diagram.
Came prepared.
Except for the one thing I'm looking for, right? Ah, found it. Okay. So this is, I'm going to share screen again. And I'm going to show you a really wonderful, ugly, but wonderful diagram that I often use in presentations. This is by a guy named Christian Rohrer. And some of you may know Christian, and he published it in the Nielsen Norman website years ago. It's a landscape of user research methods. And he has mapped user research methods along two axes: behavioral versus attitudinal, qualitative versus quantitative. And he's got 4 quadrants based on those axes. And then he's got a bit of a taxonomy of, how these products are being used during data collection. I love this because it's a great way to understand the big picture of user research. It's limited. It doesn't include certain things. I'd like it to include a lot of the techniques and methods that data scientists use, but that's another conversation for us to have. But what I feel like this doesn't really do is address cadence. And so I like this diagram that Whitney Quisenberry, it's one of our authors, created. Make it a little bigger. And what she's showing is time that is moving over, like the progression of time. You see like something like quarters here. On this axis, she's showing a number of user research methods. And then in each intersection, she's showing the cadence. So something like looking at your customer service logs may be done on a weekly basis, but doing a field study is really expensive and involved. You got to hire an ethnographer to do it, and maybe you do it once a quarter or once a year, and so on. So what I'm getting at here is that there are types of research you should be doing that are like sipping, like tasting a little bit all the time, ongoing, sampling. It's sort of like the pace layer model. There are some forms that are really deep and expensive and weighty, and you have to absorb the data in one big report, and it's hard to even take in. And I can understand that some organizations are going to be hesitant to spend on that, like as Giannis was mentioning, but I think there are methods that are like this one that you can be constantly employing inexpensively to continually learn, and that you actually should be doing that. Whether that is looking at, log data, whether that's making a point of talking to one customer a week, whether it's spending an hour doing customer service every week, even though that's not your job. And anyway, this is in the list of part article. So I'll just put that back in the chat session if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Did that help, Giannis? I think that was your question.
Of course. It's always great to roll this discussion. Everything is obvious and there are no answers at the same time. So yeah. It's great to just think about this.
Yeah, and I just don't want us to assume that research is expensive. There's always inexpensive things you can do, and you should. All right. Anyway, next.
I want to
What's most expensive?
Yeah.
Doing research or burning money after you release the product?
Yeah, Dimitris, let me follow up here with this question. So let's talk about expensive and invisible things. So research, information architecture design, UX versus product and business. Again, is this too early to realize those guys, the product business, that there are some expensive, methods and methodologies, but there are not all expensive. So why do you think this is hard to pitch to those functions that, we can do research without being expensive? Why the default mode is that research is expensive? is this not just attractive enough for this kind of world we're living to?
Oh, I think a lot of conventional or traditional user research comes out of industries, like the military, like healthcare, where there's a certain need to have generalizable results that are statistically significant. And I mean, basically it's science in a way that it has to be. And also a lot of this came out of academia, which also obviously, because of the whole tenure and publication focus of research universities, pushes us toward a scientific approach. And so I just think some of this is a hangover from those days where you had to take a very expensive scientific approach to making conclusions. I mean, I'm sure some of you, for example, do user research in healthcare, and you've worked with people with MDs, or people who are doctors, or other forms of scientists, and they're, they understandably have a very different perspective than, let's say, a product manager who's working on an app for entertainment.
That is so true. We have to, the default is being written from our past. So we have to talk on those issues, that there is research and research. So there are expensive methods and there are value for effort methods. So we constantly need to pitch those issues to the stakeholders, to business, to product. That's not a question, it's like a comment. Great.
Well, I mean, like, it's also one of these issues of labels and branding. I mean, like, you hear that word research and you shrink back because you think, oh, that just slowed everything down and it's going to be expensive. And okay, well, maybe the people who are advocating for the research need to think about having a conversation about research without using the word research.
Yes, framing.
Like I remember back in a zillion years ago when I was consulting, and my clients, my information architecture consulting clients, would say, we need a portal. A portal. Any of you remember portals? And I used to say, that's interesting. Why don't we have a conversation about this? But we're not going to use the word portal. In fact, I'm banning it right now. And if anyone uses that word, they have to throw $1 on the table. And if I use that word, I got to throw $10 on the table. We're all going to have fines if we use the word. And a lot of times, words like portal or agile or research are shorthand for a solution to a problem that has not been defined. So we're already coming up with a diagnosis because it feels right. Oh, we've got to do research. What does that even mean? What is research? It's exploration. It's satisfying the curiosity that needs to be satisfied in order to develop a product. That's really what it is. And think about, those of you who do research, how much variety there is to what you can do. So I think sometimes we get too stuck on these shorthands, these terms that we take for granted, but actually are harmful, that actually make our lives a lot harder. So my suggestion is to ban more words like research and see where you go.
May I? I've been observing, I think it's a pattern that we talk about over specialization and distinct distinctions between the company or the teams, right? We have quantitative and we have qualitative. So people are doing just that. And you have UX and you have product and you have marketing. So I think that the more we keep having discussions on us and them, like depending on how close you are to the problem, it's going to get more difficult to actually work as a team because we need all functions. So the more that we have discussions here as UX people, right? And we say we are the messiahs, and there's another call somewhere with marketing people saying we are the messiahs, then we're going to keep, I believe that we're going to keep having these problems. We're not creating a common language, as you mentioned before, and this will, well, take this problem to forever. I don't know, we're not gonna solve this.
So that's, yeah. I feel very torn about what you said. And that's because I agree that we put too much, we invest too much in labels, and we invest too much in a framework. We invest too much in common vocabularies. They're so useful, but we spend too much effort establishing them. And then because of that, we try to maintain them. We try to, keep them going, to support them, to buttress them. The Polar Bear book, I always say, was successful because it gave a common vocabulary and set of terms and concepts and a framework just at the right time for people who were struggling with information challenges. And those people came from different disciplines: usability people, librarians, graphic designers, writers. And it just was good because it got those people to the point where they could actually have productive conversations with each other. And that's great. And then you have that moment of having a Rosetta Stone that enables people to actually get things done who come from different backgrounds. It helps those blind men have a conversation and figure out the elephant. But the problem is, how long can that language and that framework last? And if I see myself as an information architect, and I did show up with the shirt, polar bears, and then like 3 years later, or 10 years later, it doesn't really work anymore. And I'm mad because my identity is wrapped up with information architecture or UX or product design or whatever the next thing is going to be. I don't know, that just feels sad and unproductive. So that's why I feel like you're right. We have to keep having these conversations, and we keep getting hopefully to the brink of a new Rosetta Stone to help us do good work together and have good conversations together. I mean, half the battle is having a good conversation. But we're not good at letting these things go. And I think a lot of it is because our identities are so wrapped up in these frameworks. And I don't know what to do about that.
I like this dramatic pause because everyone start thinking about this. So that's great. Okay, I'm not going to follow up here, and I'm going to give priority to Konstantinos because I can see his raised hand. So Konstantinos, please ask your question directly to Louis.
Thank you, Jens. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So a question to Lou. I was wondering if you have any words of advice for somebody who is, only now just beginning as a UX designer. We live in this wonderful era where there's so much information, free and available for everybody. But sometimes, it can be kind of overwhelming for somebody new. I was wondering if you've got any wisdom for us.
Read less, talk more. So one of the things that we have really learned in the last year and a half is that, well, first of all, a lot of people who study learning say that learning is social. We don't really learn by ourselves. I don't know if that's 100% true or not, but I think there's something to it. And when we, like I said, we do 4 conferences a year. Last year, we had to virtualize our conferences. And if your main line of business is putting on conferences in person, and suddenly you have to virtualize them, it is frightening. it was not a happy time a year ago, March, for us. And we did a lot of work on virtualization. And one of the things we hit upon was the idea of creating attendee cohorts for our virtual conferences. And so what we do is we get together randomly assigned groups of around 10 conference attendees, and we pair them with facilitators, and they basically experience each conference together. And what that means is they convene in Zoom, usually right before the conference starts, to meet each other and understand what they want to learn together. And they might create a canvas, a mural or Miro. Then they're in a private Slack channel while the conference is happening. They're talking. They reconvene once a day in person on Zoom, and then they have a wrap up when the conference is done. Now, what that's done is make our virtual conferences as good and maybe even better experiences, both for learning as well as for networking, than in-person conferences, especially for the introverts, especially for the younger people who don't have a lot of confidence. It's very democratizing to interact with people in places like Slack and Zoom. So I bring this up because what that taught us is that the content is only part of it. It's the engagement with the content in a social way. That is how you really learn. And so when I say read less, talk more, I'm suggesting you really seek out places, communities, events like this, where people are engaging together over content. So like a good example would be a book club. You're still reading, but the important thing is to be interacting with people over that content. And that, to me, is not just good for someone starting out, but it's good for anyone in the field. So you may be starting out and what you need isn't so much learning, it's networking. It's a great way to network is over a common piece of information that you want to learn about with other people. You have that in common. And if you're looking to learn and you don't really want to network, it's still a good way to learn. It helps everybody. And there's just something to be said for engaging with content with people. So that's my advice. A very long answer to, again, a very innocent question.
A follow-up question here that I think it's always great when you have to, end a great discussion. Would you rather question, Luis, would you rather stop publishing more books, or would you rather stop organizing events? If you had to choose one of them.
Oh gosh, I mean,
sorry for that.
They're so intertwined. I've done a lot of navel gazing, like most people, and what I finally have realized, I'm 56, and I just figured out that my passion is to convene people and content. That's what we're just sort of saying, engagement over information, engagement over content. If I had to choose, I'd rather convene the people than the content. But you got to realize that books are very social in the way they're created, at least the way we create them. Lots of people convene to create our books. And our authors don't go sit in an attic by themselves for a year and write. It's very social. And so it's hard for me to say no to books, but I guess if I had to choose, I would choose conferences.
Thanks for answering such a question. I have to give priority to Sotiris. I saw his hand raised. So we have room for, I think, 1 or 2 questions. We have a lot of questions in the backlog, but we have to give priority to direct questions. Sotiris.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much up until now for all your answers. Have been amazing. You showed a diagram earlier after Christian Roy's one, the one with the cadence, which practically indicates, if we think about it, the difference, this cadence of research. Yes, exactly, this one. It indicates the difference between we do research, and we did research once last year with 2 users, like the difference between these two, the frequency of it.
Yeah.
And it's something that we actually had discussed. I don't know if Deb is still here, but we have discussed this a couple of times in the past. So at the same time, research gives birth to more research, especially when it comes to generative research, right? You have to conduct, it's not everything is as simple as, you run a tree test after a cards. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But after a generative kind of or field research or ethnographic round, you have new data and you have to make decisions based on that data. So you cannot plan ahead the way that a project manager will put down and start creating diagrams such as this one, Gantt charts,
right?
Research to go ahead. Any ideas or approaches in order to maintain this cadence without overcommitting in a way to what kind of research we're going to do next, because we don't have the data to make this informed decision?
That's a really great question. I don't have a good answer. I think someone who is a real user researcher would probably do a much better job than I would. But let me offer one idea. This is sort of in the same vein as banning words. One of the real problems I see with research is that you come up with a question and the answer is so interesting that you want, or the question is so interesting that you want to answer it repeatedly. That's good. And helps you with benchmarking and so forth. But you take that answer and you put it in this thing called a report. And the report, it's like this armor, and the question and the answer have to like be bundled in this report, and it can't ever change. And the report becomes something that it's like muscle memory. You just like, oh, did we get the monthly report yet on such and such? And you just like use this word report to totally space away or to totally distance yourself from not only the answer, but the question. You forget what you were even asking when it comes like clockwork in a report. So I wonder, just like maybe the word research is problematic, could we free ourselves a bit from the concern that you're rightly bringing up, namely that our questions are not allowed to be flexible if we stop using the word report? Because eventually, if you're just focusing on questions and their answers, and you close that distance between you and the question, you're going to see the questions becoming stale, outdated, no longer relevant. And isn't that the death of research? When the results are just no longer really relevant, but we're producing them anyway because we're supposed to. So that's the best I can do in an answer. But I do think I'd question the way we label and package what we do, namely calling it research and packaging it as a report.
Thanks a lot, Luis. We have time for one more question. So, Dimitris, would you like to ask this question? I think that's a great closure to this session. It's your question from the backlog, so I think that you deserve this.
Well, I think that Luis has kind of answered this question, but since we have a lot of people that are just starting, I might do it. So, Lou, what do you suggest today to a younger Lou? What would you do different if you were starting your career in UX, in this world, in this context?
My psychology is, my defect is that I've always been embarrassed at my lack of depth in practice. And so when I have a conversation like this, people who, might think I can give them great information at a tactical level about some aspect of information, architecture or user experience. And I feel like I'm really more of a generalist. I used to feel that was a bad thing and I was embarrassed about it. And I do think there's room for people who are generalists to put things together and to convene the people who are the deep experts and step back and create the platform for those experts to figure things out. That's okay, but somebody has to convene them. That's what a generalist does, whether you're convening people with expertise, a team, or even information. It's okay to be a generalist. In fact, it can be really lucrative. You can, not to say that I'm a billionaire or anything, but if you want to make a good living as a consultant, what you do is you call yourself a strategist. And you know what the difference is between a strategist and a generalist? Does anybody know?
Money.
What is it?
This question triggers me, but I would prefer not to answer here because we need 5 more hours.
All right, well, I will answer it for you.
Okay, please. Yeah, please go.
The difference between a strategist and a generalist is 2 weeks.
Okay, can you elaborate on this? Because you drop a bomb here.
You just got to be 2 weeks ahead of everyone else. That's all.
Oh, great. Yeah. A spring ahead is enough. Yeah. Great. That's true. Oh, okay. I wish we had more time to continue this, but we have to wrap up. Luis, let me just share my screen again. Here it is. Okay, great. So, Luis, thank you once again for being here and having this discussion. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. We have a lot of questions in the backlog. We tried to ask you the most of them, but it was hard to have them all. So thank you again for your questions. Please ask your unanswered questions on LinkedIn to trigger the discussion there. Use the UX Greece hashtags to find them and start talking. As Luis said, less reading, more talking on UX. This is the tip. But also read, okay, not just talking. So before we end this session, it's time for you to win some great books and some special offers on upcoming courses from our sponsors, Ansel Labs, the UX Prodigy, and From Scratch Design Studio. So the first gift, we're going to give a few books, and this is what you have to do. What we have already said, go to LinkedIn, post anything, ask your question, ask anything, introduce yourself, say thanks to Luis, using the hashtags UX Greece. In the next 4 hours, we're going to gather the posts and find who are the lucky ones and send you a message to arrange the deliveries of the books. The books are going to be from Rosenfeld Media, of course, and the known Polar Bear book. We'll try to find this shirt of Luis, and if I will manage to do, that would be an interesting gift for upcoming events. So the second gift is a special offer for you. The first 2 people to send an email to info@uxprodigy.com will get a 50% discount for the upcoming workshop of the UX Prodigy. It's about listen to your customers, learn how to design effective online service. Panagiotis, is that right?
Yeah, this is right. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
A few things about, survey-based research. Yes.
So I'm going to leave those information here, and I'm going to send them in the chat to take your time and read on the information. Also, stay tuned on upcoming events. Follow UX Greece on LinkedIn. Follow Athens UX Community and Thessaloniki UX Meetup on meetup.com to get notified on everything that is being scheduled. And I think that's a wrap.
Last but not least,
Yeah,
follow Rosenfeld Media. We're going to post the links on